Montana Rockies, November 1934. While the ranchers of Glacier County were nailing extra boards across their windows and the Blackfeet families were reinforcing their timber cabins with layers of mud and straw, 15-year-old Thomas Whitehorse was stacking stones into a pyramid on the eastern edge of the Badger II Medicine Wilderness, where no sensible person would build anything at all. The structure rose 12 feet at its apex, constructed entirely from granite slabs he'd hauled from a collapsed mine shaft 3 miles south. Each stone had been selected for flatness on at least 2 sides, fitted together without mortar in a pattern that spiraled inward as it climbed. The base measured 16 feet on each side, and the entrance faced precisely 15 degrees east of true south. To anyone passing by, and few did, given the location, it looked like some strange monument a lunatic might erect before freezing to death. "Boy's building his own tomb," Clayton Hutchins said at the Saturday meeting of the Browning Town Council, where Thomas had come to register his land claim on the 12 acres nobody else wanted. "Granite don't hold heat. Wind'll cut right through those gaps between stones. He'll be dead by Christmas, and we'll have to haul his frozen corpse down, come spring thaw." But Thomas had no intention of dying. He had spent 3 years learning from his grandmother, Agnes, before tuberculosis took her that previous winter, and she had taught him that the white man's approach to cold, building wooden boxes and burning through cords of firewood to heat the air inside them, was fighting nature instead of working with it. The earth itself was warm, she'd said. The trick was knowing how to borrow that warmth and keep it where you needed it. Before we continue with Thomas's remarkable story, I want to know, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story of a 15-year-old orphan who survived brutal winter conditions that killed dozens of others, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel for more incredible stories of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. Your support helps us bring you more amazing true stories like this one. Now, let's get back to Thomas's story. The happy years had been brief but vivid in Thomas's memory. From age 7 to 12, he'd spent every summer with his grandmother Agnes in the cabin she'd built herself in the foothills west of Browning. His mother was Blackfeet, his father a ranch hand from Oklahoma who'd left when Thomas was 3. His mother had worked as a seamstress in Great Falls, sending Thomas to her mother each June when school let out. Those summers, Agnes had taught him everything. How to read the sky 3 days ahead by watching how the birds flew. How to find water by following the paths deer took at dawn. How to identify which stones held heat longest by their weight and color. How to orient a shelter so it caught winter sun but deflected summer heat. She'd grown up in the traditional ways before the reservation system had confined the Blackfeet, and she carried knowledge in her bones that couldn't be found in any white man's book. The old people knew cold, she'd told him, one August evening in 1931 as they sat outside her cabin watching the stars emerge. Not how to fight it with fire, how to live with it, how to make a place where cold couldn't reach you even when it was trying its hardest. She'd described the winter lodges some of the northern tribes had used, structures partially underground, covered with earth and stones, shaped to shed wind and hold the earth's warmth inside. She'd drawn diagrams in the dirt, shown him the mathematics of angles and thermal mass, explained how stone collected heat during the day and released it slowly through the night, how soil insulated better than any manufactured material, how shape mattered as much as substance. Then came the winter of 1932. His mother died of influenza in January. The seamstress shop where she'd worked sent her body and her few possessions, 3 dresses, a sewing kit, $18, to Agnes's cabin. Thomas left Great Falls, left the boarding house where they'd lived, left school, and moved in permanently with his grandmother. For 2 years, it was enough. Agnes taught him to hunt, to trap, to tan hides, to preserve meat. She taught him the names of plants in both Blackfeet and English, which ones healed and which ones killed. She taught him patience, observation, silence. She taught him that white society's way of doing things was not the only way, and often not the best way. But tuberculosis didn't care about wisdom or strength. It took Agnes slowly through the autumn of 1933, ate her lungs bit by bit, left her coughing blood into rags. Thomas boiled every evening. She died on January 4th, 1934, with snow falling outside and Thomas holding her hand. The Indian agency sent a man named Morrison, who informed Thomas that the cabin and land belonged to the government, not to Agnes, and therefore not to him. Morrison looked through the cabin's sparse contents: tools, hides, dried meat, Agnes's few personal items, and declared it all government property. Thomas was to report to the Catholic boarding school in Browning within 1 week, or be placed with a guardian of the agency's choosing. Instead, Thomas packed everything he could carry: Agnes's hunting knife, her fire starting kit, 1 wool blanket, a small pot, a hatchet, 20 feet of rope, her journal where she'd written down the old teachings, and the $18 his mother had left him, and walked away. He'd been to Browning twice with Agnes. He knew Clayton Hutchins ran the town council and also owned the land office. He knew Hutchins was the kind of man who smiled while cheating you and called it business. But he also knew that the Homestead Act, whatever its other cruelties, allowed anyone to claim unused land if they could prove they'd improved it. The plot Thomas found had been surveyed and abandoned. 12 acres on a windswept shelf of rock and thin soil at 6,200 feet elevation, 4 miles from the nearest road, backed against cliffs too steep to graze cattle on. The previous claimant had given up after one winter when his timber cabin had burned down, apparently from overheating the stove in desperate cold. Thomas could still see the charred foundation timbers when he arrived in March. What Thomas saw that others missed was threefold. First, the site faced south-southeast with no obstructions. It would catch every available minute of winter sun. Second, the cliff behind created a natural windbreak against the prevailing northwest storms. Third, the worthless rocky soil covered a stable granite shelf that extended deep into the mountainside, a foundation that would never shift or settle, and, more importantly, a thermal mass connected to the Earth's deep warmth. He spent 3 weeks just watching. Where exactly did the sun rise and set as the seasons changed? Where did snow accumulate, and where did wind scour it away? Where did water run during the spring melt? What was the angle of incoming sunlight at different times of day? He slept under a rock overhang with his 1 blanket and ate sparingly from his supplies. He took notes in the margins of Agnes's journal. He calculated angles with sticks and shadows. The conventional approach to building in Montana cold was timber frame construction, thick walls, massive stoves, and cords upon cords of firewood. Thomas had watched these buildings his entire life. They leaked heat constantly, dried the air until your nose bled, created temperature gradients so severe you'd sweat near the stove while frost formed on the far walls. They required constant feeding, constant maintenance, constant labor. And when the truly bitter cold arrived, 30, 40 below, they struggled. People died in them, froze in their beds when stoves went out, asphyxiated from poor ventilation when they sealed every crack. Thomas's approach came from Agnes's teachings about the old winter lodges, but modified with his own observations and calculations. He would build not a box, but a pyramid. He would build it primarily of stone. He would sink it partially into the earth, and he would orient and proportion it according to principles of solar collection and thermal mass that Agnes had drawn in the dirt, but that Thomas now understood through his weeks of observation. The first task was excavation. The structure would not sit on the earth, but in it. Using the hatchet, a sharpened stick, and his bare hands, Thomas dug a circular pit 16 feet in diameter and 3 feet deep at the center, sloping to 18 inches at the edges. The granite shelf lay just 2 feet down, which was perfect. It gave him depth for insulation while providing a solid base. The work took 11 days. His hands blistered, healed, and calloused. He ate pine nuts and the remaining dried venison from Agnes's stores. Next came stone collection. The abandoned mine shaft 3 miles south had collapsed decades ago, leaving granite slabs scattered across a quarter-mile radius. Thomas made 47 trips over 3 weeks, carrying stones that ranged from 20 to 60 pounds each. He selected for specific characteristics: flatness, density, thickness between 4 and 8 inches. Agnes had taught him that the best thermal mass stones were dense enough to sink in water and rang with a clear tone when struck. The foundation course went down in a square, each side measuring 16 feet external dimension. But Thomas didn't simply stack the stones. He'd learned from Agnes that heat flowed through gaps, so each stone had to seat firmly against its neighbors with minimal space between. He used smaller stone chips as shims. adjusting until each piece sat stable without rocking. The mortar was earth itself, subsoil mixed with clay from a stream bank half a mile east and water, worked into a thick paste that filled every remaining crack. The principle was simple: eliminate air gaps. Air circulates, carries heat away. Solid thermal mass doesn't. A stone wall with air gaps is cold. A stone wall with earth-sealed joints becomes a single unified heat battery. By late May, Thomas had completed 4 courses around the entire perimeter, bringing the walls to 32 inches above the exterior ground level, but 50 inches above the interior floor due to the excavation. The structure was already taking shape, but it didn't look like any building the ranchers of Glacier County recognized. That's when Clayton Hutchins rode up with 2 other men from the land office, arriving on a Tuesday afternoon when Thomas was fitting stones for the 5th course. "So, this is the improvement," Hutchins said, dismounting and walking around the pyramid's emerging base. His companions followed, one of them laughing. "Looks more like a root cellar than a house, boy." Thomas set down the stone he'd been positioning and straightened. "It's a shelter, meets the requirement." "Requirement is a habitable dwelling," Hutchins replied. He was a thick-bodied man with gray in his beard and eyes that assessed everything for monetary value. "This ain't habitable. It's a hole in the ground with some rocks around it." "It will be habitable by October," Thomas said. "That gives me until spring to prove residence, according to the Homestead Act." One of Hutchins' companions, a younger man named Porter, kicked at the wall. "Ain't even mortared proper. These gaps will let wind through soon as winter hits. And what are you planning for a roof? Where's your timber? Your stove?" "I have a plan for those," Thomas said. Hutchins walked closer, looking down at Thomas with an expression that mixed contempt with something that might have been pity. "Listen, son, I knew your grandmother. She was a good woman in her way, but she filled your head with old stories that don't apply to modern living. This idea, whatever it is you're building, it's going to get you killed. Now, I can still cancel this claim, and the boarding school will take you. You'll learn a trade, have a future. Better than freezing to death out here, trying to prove some point about Indian ways being just as good as civilized methods." Thomas felt heat in his chest, but kept his voice level. "The claim is legal. I've met the requirements, and the structure will work." "Stone don't hold heat, boy," Porter said. "Every rancher knows that. Why do you think we build with timber?" "Stone holds more heat than wood," Thomas replied. 8 times more per pound. Agnes taught me that. You can test it if you want. Put a stone and a piece of wood in a fire for an hour, pull them out, see which one stays warm longer." Hutchins shook his head slowly. "You're talking about a campfire, not a house. We've been building timber homes in Montana for 70 years, thousands of them. They work. This," he gestured at the pyramid, "this is some fantasy from a time before civilization arrived, before science." "Science is measurement," Thomas said. "When this is done, I'll show you measurements." "You'll be dead," Hutchins said flatly. "We've had 3 boys die in the backcountry in the last 5 years, trapping mostly, but same principle. Thought they knew better than their elders, thought old Indian tricks would keep them alive, found their bodies come spring. I ain't got time to keep arguing with a stubborn kid. You've got till September to show me something that looks like it'll keep you alive through winter, or I'm pulling this claim on grounds of insufficient improvement and imminent danger. That's my authority as land office administrator." He remounted his horse, and the 3 men rode back down the trail. Thomas watched them go, then returned to his stonework. He had 16 weeks until September. The walls needed to reach 12 feet at the corners and spiral inward to meet at a central point. He had perhaps 400 more stones to place. If you want to find out how a 15-year-old orphan with no money and no support created a shelter that would stay warm at 48 degrees below zero, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Thomas Whitehorse built would eventually shelter 16 people during the worst winter Montana had seen in recorded history, and would change how some northern communities thought about cold weather construction. Through June and July, Thomas worked 12 hours a day. The pyramid rose in courses, each one smaller than the last, as the walls angled inward at 73 degrees, steeper than the 70-degree angle Agnes had described, but Thomas had calculated that the steeper angle would shed snow more efficiently, while still allowing adequate interior volume. The mathematics worked out to 183 square feet of floor space, enough for sleeping, storage, and a small work area. But the real innovation wasn't the shape, it was the thermal system. As the walls reached 6 feet high, Thomas began constructing a secondary structure within them. Using smaller stones and carefully packed earth, he created a 2-foot gap between the exterior pyramid wall and an interior wall. This cavity he filled not with air but with earth, subsoil hauled from the excavation site and elsewhere, mixed with clay and packed tight in 6-inch layers, each layer allowed to dry before adding the next. The principle came from Agnes's description of the old winter lodges. Air is an insulator, but not a perfect one. It can circulate, create convection currents, move heat. Earth is a better insulator, and more importantly, it's a thermal mass. Once warmed, it releases that heat slowly, steadily, for hours after the heat source is removed. A thick earth-filled wall warmed by winter sun during the day would radiate that warmth inward all night. The entrance was the most critical design element. Thomas oriented it 15 degrees east of south, which meant it would catch the low-angle winter sun from the moment it rose until mid-afternoon. But an open doorway would bleed heat catastrophically. Agnes had taught him about the tunnel entrance design, a passageway that turned 90 degrees, preventing direct wind penetration while trapping warm air inside. Thomas excavated a 10-foot tunnel, angling down from ground level, reinforced it with stone walls and a flat stone roof, then had it turn sharply left before opening into the main chamber. The tunnel floor he covered with flat stones that would absorb daytime heat and release it slowly. Cold air, being denser, would sink and pool in the tunnel bend rather than entering the main space. By August, the walls had risen to 10 feet, and the inward spiral was becoming obvious. Thomas had developed a rhythm with the stones, could judge by weight and feel which piece would fit where. His body had changed too. He'd lost the softness of adolescence, gained ropey muscle in his shoulders and back, developed the endurance to work from dawn until dark without faltering. He was fitting capstones for the tunnel roof when a voice called out, "Hello, the camp!" Thomas emerged to find a man in his 30s, lean and weathered, leading a pack mule. He recognized the face, but not the name, someone who worked for one of the ranches south of Browning. "Name's John Reese," the man said. "Heard about what you're building up here, rode up to see for myself." He looked at the pyramid, now 10 feet high with its entrance tunnel clearly visible. "Mind if I take a closer look?" Thomas nodded. Few people had come by, and those who had were generally hostile or mocking. Reese's tone seemed different, curious rather than dismissive. Reese walked slowly around the structure, occasionally touching the walls, peering at the joints between stones. He crouched at the tunnel entrance, looked inside. "You're building thermal mass," he said finally. "Passive solar collection, earth insulation." Thomas felt something release in his chest. Someone understood. "You've seen this before?" "Read about it," Reese said. "There's an architect back east, fellow name of Frank Lloyd Wright, been experimenting with what he calls organic architecture, working with the land instead of on top of it. And I've heard stories from old-timers about how the Pueblo peoples down in the Southwest build, thick adobe, earth-covered, oriented to catch winter sun. This what your grandmother taught you?" "Some of it," Thomas said. "The principles. I worked out the specific design myself." Reese nodded slowly. "The pyramid shape is interesting, sheds wind and snow efficiently, minimal surface area for heat loss relative to interior volume, structural strength without internal supports." He looked at Thomas with something like respect. "Hutchins thinks you're crazy. I think you might be smarter than everyone who's been calling you crazy." They talked for an hour. Reese asked detailed questions about the earth-filling technique, the tunnel entrance, the planned ventilation system. Thomas explained each element, and Reese listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking for clarification. "You'll need fresh air," Reese said. "Seal this up too tight and you'll suffocate or fill it with moisture condensation." Thomas showed him the ventilation plan. 4 6-inch tubes made from hollowed pine branches, positioned at the apex of the pyramid, extending 3 feet above the peak. The tubes would draw moisture and stale air out through convection, warm air rising, while the tunnel entrance would allow fresh air in. Not enough airflow to create drafts, but enough for healthy breathing and moisture control. "That's actually clever," Reese said. "Simple, no moving parts to fail." He glanced at the lowering sun. "I should get back, but listen, you need anything, food or tools or whatnot? I'm at the Clark Ranch most days." "You did good work here, Thomas." Don't let Hutchins or anyone else tell you different." He rode away, and Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced since Agnes died. The sense that he wasn't entirely alone. Someone had looked at what he was building and seen not lunacy, but logic. Through late August and into September, Thomas completed the upper courses. The pyramid narrowed until he was fitting stones barely 2 feet on a side, positioning them carefully so the spiral pattern continued unbroken to the apex. The peak itself was a single flat stone he'd saved for the purpose, 18 inches square and 4 inches thick, with holes drilled through it using a metal spike and endless patience. These holes would hold the ventilation tubes. The interior work was equally demanding. Thomas plastered the inner walls with clay mixed with dried grass, creating a smooth surface that would prevent earth from crumbling loose. The floor he covered with flat stones fitted tightly together, then covered those with a layer of gravel and sand for drainage, then a final layer of flat stones. This triple layer would act as thermal mass, absorbing heat from sun that entered through the tunnel and from any fire he built. For heating, Thomas didn't plan to use a conventional iron stove. Instead, he built what Agnes had called a firebox, a stone chamber 2 feet on each side, positioned near the center of the floor, but offset toward the entrance. The firebox had a stone floor, stone walls on 3 sides, and an open top. Smoke would rise to the pyramid peak, where it would flow out through one of the ventilation tubes. The firebox would heat stones placed inside it. He'd collected 24 smooth river rocks specifically for this purpose, and those stones would radiate heat long after the fire died. A small fire of pine branches for 1 hour could heat the stones enough to radiate warmth for 6 to 8 hours. On September 27th, Clayton Hutchins returned. This time he came alone in the late afternoon when long shadows stretched across the granite shelf. Thomas was inside, arranging his few possessions: the blanket, the pot, Agnes's journal, the remaining tools. He heard hoofbeats, emerged into the tunnel, and climbed out to find Hutchins dismounted, staring at the completed pyramid. "I'll be damned," Hutchins said quietly. Then, louder, "Still don't think it'll work, but you've met the letter of the claim requirement. It's a structure. It's enclosed. Whether it's habitable, we'll find out." He pulled papers from his saddlebag. "You've got until March to prove 6 months' residence. If you're still alive then, the claim's yours." "I'll be alive," Thomas said. Hutchins looked at him for a long moment. "Maybe, but pride won't keep you warm, boy. My cabin's got 2 stoves, and I still go through 4 cords of wood a winter. You've got what? A fire pit and some stones?" "The stones hold heat," Thomas said. "The earth insulates. The shape sheds wind. The tunnel blocks drafts. The sun warms it during the day. I don't need 4 cords of wood." "Sun don't shine much in January," Hutchins replied. "And when it gets to 30, 40 below, you'll be wishing you'd built something sensible." He mounted his horse. "Got a boy about your age. I'd never let him try something fool like this. But you're on your own, and that's your choice. Hope you don't die making it." He rode away. Thomas returned inside, descended the tunnel. The temperature drop was noticeable, but not severe, and entered the main chamber. The space was dim, lit only by indirect light from the tunnel. He'd built no windows. Windows in extreme cold were heat leaks, and the low winter sun coming through the tunnel entrance would provide adequate light for the few waking hours when he'd be inside. He lit a small fire in the firebox using pine twigs and needles. The smoke rose cleanly to the peak and flowed out the ventilation tube he'd designated for exhaust. He added slightly larger pieces, let the fire burn for 40 minutes, then placed 6 of his river rocks into the firebox using a forked stick. The stones rested in the coals, absorbing heat. After another 20 minutes, he used the stick to roll them out onto the flat stone surface surrounding the firebox. The heat radiating from those 6 stones was immediately noticeable. Thomas dampened the fire, reducing it to coals, and waited. 2 hours later, the stones were still warm to the touch. The air in the chamber had risen from the ambient 58 degrees to 67. Outside, as evening fell, the temperature dropped to 42. He built a small fire each evening through October, testing and refining. He learned that hardwood branches, though scarce, held heat in the stones longer than pine. He learned that 10 stones heated for 90 minutes would keep the chamber comfortable for 12 hours. He learned that on sunny days, no fire was needed at all, The tunnel floor and interior walls absorbed enough solar heat to keep the space at 65 degrees, even when outside temperatures were in the 30s. He gathered firewood methodically, cutting deadfalls into 18-inch lengths suitable for the firebox. By November, he had a stack of 320 pieces, enough for one fire per day for 3 months, assuming he used 10 pieces per fire, but he suspected he'd need far less. On sunny winter days, he might not need fire at all. November was mild. Snow fell but melted within days. Thomas settled into routines. He trapped rabbits and squirrels for meat and fur. He hiked to Browning once every 2 weeks to buy cornmeal, beans, and salt with the last of his money, and to prove to Hutchins that he was alive. He read Agnes's journal by firelight, rereading the teachings she'd recorded, feeling her presence in the words. On November 18th, a memory surfaced as he worked to seal a small crack he'd discovered in the interior wall. Agnes, 3 years earlier, showing him how to mix clay and sand for durable plaster. "Always give it time," she'd said. "Rushed work fails, patient work endures. The earth teaches you patience if you're willing to learn." She'd been talking about plaster, but also about life, about resilience, about the fact that survival wasn't dramatic, it was methodical. Do the small things correctly, prepare thoroughly, respect the forces you couldn't control, and work skillfully with those you could. "I wish you could see this," Thomas said aloud to the empty chamber. His voice echoed softly off the stone walls. "I built what you taught me. I don't know if it's right, but I followed what you said." The stones made no answer, but the warmth radiating from the firebox felt like enough. December arrived with the first serious cold. Temperatures dropped to 15 degrees, then 10, then 0. Thomas burned fires every evening, heating the stones, letting them radiate through the night. The chamber stayed at 63 to 68 degrees. He slept comfortably under his single blanket, woke with no frost on the walls, no ice in his water pot. On December 22nd, John Reese appeared at mid-morning. Leading his mule again, Thomas invited him inside. Reese descended the tunnel, and Thomas heard his breath catch as he entered the main chamber. Outside, the temperature was 7 degrees. Inside, it was 66. "What's your heat source?" Reese asked, looking around. The firebox held only cold ash from the previous evening. "Stones," Thomas said. He explained the system, heating river rocks, letting them radiate. "Last night's fire was 8 hours ago. The stones are still releasing heat, and the walls hold it." Reese touched the interior wall. It was faintly warm. "Thermal mass," he said. "You've turned the entire structure into a heat battery." He shook his head slowly. "I thought the theory was sound, but seeing it work this well..." He looked at Thomas. "Hutchins needs to see this." "Hutchins won't come," Thomas said. "He's decided I'm wrong. Seeing evidence won't change that." "Maybe," Reese said, "but word's spreading that you're surviving up here. People are curious. Some are starting to wonder if maybe the old ways have something to teach us after all." They talked for an hour. Reese had brought supplies, coffee, flour, some salt pork, which Thomas accepted gratefully. His money was gone, and trapping had been slower than he'd hoped. Reese also brought news from town. 2 ranchers had lost cattle to the cold. One family had abandoned their homestead after their cabin partially collapsed under heavy snow. The consensus in Browning was that this winter was shaping up to be a hard one. "You've got enough firewood?" Reese asked. "For 3 months if I burn every night," Thomas said, "but I don't think I'll need to. Sunny days, the tunnel brings in enough warmth." Reese left mid-afternoon, and Thomas returned to his routines, but the conversation had unsettled him slightly. He'd been focused on his own survival, his own proof. It hadn't occurred to him that others might be watching, might be questioning their own assumptions based on his experiment. January arrived with brutality. The temperature dropped to 20 below on January 6th, then 25 below on the 9th, then 30 below on the 12th. Thomas burned fires nightly, used 12 stones instead of 10, kept the firebox coals hot for 2 hours. Inside the pyramid, the temperature held at 62 degrees. He wore a single layer of clothing, felt no discomfort. Then came the deep cold. On January 19th, 1935, a high-pressure system settled over Montana that would later be documented as one of the most severe Arctic outbreaks in regional history. The temperature at the weather station in Browning dropped to 41 degrees below zero on January 20th. By January 22nd, it had reached 46 below. On January 23rd, it touched 48 below zero and stayed there for 36 hours. Across Glacier County, 16 people died. An elderly couple in their timber cabin 3 miles south of Browning were found frozen in their bed. Their stove had consumed their entire woodpile in 3 days. They'd burned furniture to keep it going, and finally the fuel had run out and the cold had taken them in their sleep. A trapper named Mitchell was found beside his sled, his dogs dead in their traces, frozen solid while trying to reach town. A family of 4 on the eastern edge of the county survived by burning their barn and half their house, huddling in one room with their livestock, barely making it through with severe frostbite on 3 of them. Clayton Hutchins in his well-built timber house with 2 iron stoves and walls insulated with sawdust, burned through 7 cords of wood in 4 days. His wife developed pneumonia from the wild temperature swings, 70 degrees near the stove, below freezing in the bedrooms. His son suffered frostbite on 3 fingers when the bedroom stove went out overnight. Hutchins himself, struggling to keep both stoves fed, hauling firewood every 2 hours, got frostbite on his ears during one of those trips. The town of Browning became a desperate place, with families huddling together, burning anything combustible, praying the cold would break. John Reese, snowed in at the Clark Ranch 15 miles from Thomas's pyramid, thought about the boy on the granite shelf and assumed he was dead. You couldn't survive that cold in a stone pile with a firebox. It was impossible. Even with thermal mass, even with earth insulation, 48 below zero for 36 hours would overwhelm any passive system. Reese felt grief, felt guilt for not insisting Thomas come down before the cold hit, felt anger at himself for encouraging the boy's experiment. On January 25th, when the temperature finally rose to 20 below and the roads became barely passable, Reese saddled his horse despite the ranch owner's protests. He had to know, had to see. If Thomas was dead, someone needed to recover the body before scavengers found it. If somehow, impossibly, he was alive, he'd need help, need food, need medical attention for frostbite. The journey took 4 hours through snow that drifted hip-deep in places. The wind had carved the surface into frozen waves that the horse struggled to navigate. Reese's face went numb, despite the wool scarf wrapped around it. His hands, even in thick gloves, lost feeling. The cold was still deadly, still eager to kill. He reached the granite shelf at noon. The pyramid stood unchanged, its dark stone sides crusted with wind-blown snow and ice. No smoke rose from the ventilation tubes. No tracks led to or from the entrance tunnel. It looked abandoned, lifeless, exactly like what Reese expected to find. A tomb for a stubborn boy who'd refused to accept that some things couldn't be done. Reese dismounted, his legs stiff from cold. He approached the tunnel entrance, dreading what he'd find inside. Frozen body, extinguished fire, the final proof that innovation and wisdom couldn't overcome 48 below zero. He ducked into the tunnel. The darkness was absolute after the brilliant snow glare outside. He moved by feel, one hand on the stone wall. The tunnel turned left. He saw dim light ahead, heard something that stopped him completely. Movement and humming. Someone was humming a tune Reese recognized, an old hymn his mother used to sing. He stepped into the main chamber, and his brain couldn't process what his senses reported. Warmth. Overwhelming, impossible warmth that hit him like a physical thing after the brutal cold outside. Thomas Whitehorse sat cross-legged on the floor near the far wall, wearing a single cotton shirt, mending a trap by the light that filtered through the tunnel entrance. He looked up as Reese entered, smiled slightly. "John," Thomas said, "didn't expect company in this cold." Reese stood frozen, not by temperature but by shock. The air in the chamber was comfortable. He could feel it on his face, feel his numb cheeks beginning to tingle as circulation returned. He fumbled with his gloves, pulled them off. His hands, white and painful from cold, began to warm immediately. "What?" Reese's voice failed. He cleared his throat. "What temperature is it in here?" Thomas glanced at a small thermometer hanging from a cord on the wall, something Reese hadn't noticed before. 64 degrees, Thomas said. "Dropped from 67 last night, but the sun should bring it back up this afternoon." "It's 48 below outside," Reese said. The words came out strangled. "48 below for 2 days." "I know," Thomas said. "Coldest I've seen, but the structure held." Reese moved deeper into the chamber, on legs that trembled. He reached out and touched the interior wall. It was warm, genuinely warm, like stone that had been sitting in summer sun. "How?" Thomas stood, set aside his trap. "Thermal mass. On the 19th, when I could tell the serious cold was coming, I built a larger fire than usual, heated 20 stones for 3 hours, placed them around the chamber, let them radiate. The walls and floor absorbed that heat, held it. I've been adding just a few pieces of wood every 12 hours since, just enough to maintain. The earth-filled walls and the tunnel entrance block almost all heat loss. What little escapes gets replaced by the heated stones and the small maintenance fires. How much wood are you burning? Reese asked. Maybe 6 pieces a day, less than half a cord for the entire cold spell. I burned 7 cords in 4 days, Reese said, and my house got down to 30 degrees in the bedrooms. Hutchins burned more than that. People died, Thomas, froze in cabins that should have protected them. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, the cabins fight the cold. This shelter works with what's already here. The earth's warmth, the stone's capacity to hold heat, the shape that sheds cold wind instead of catching it. Reese moved to the firebox. It held a tiny fire, barely more than coals, with 3 stones resting in the embers. The heat radiating from those 3 stones was noticeable even from 3 feet away. He knelt, held his hands near them, felt the warmth penetrate deep into his cold, stiffened fingers. "You've proven something that's going to change things," Reese said. "You know that, right? This isn't just about you surviving. This is about a different way to live in cold country." "Agnes's way," Thomas said. "The old way." "Maybe," Reese said, "but you're the one who built it. You're the one who did the calculations, refined the design, made it work." He stood, looked around the chamber with new understanding. The curved walls, the earth fill, the precise orientation, the thermal mass. People need to see this. Hutchins needs to see this. "Will he come?" Thomas asked. "After what just happened? After 16 people died and dozens more barely survived? After everyone in the county burned through their winter wood supplies, and we've still got 2 months of cold ahead?" Reese nodded slowly. "Yeah, he'll come, and he'll bring others." Reese left an hour later, after warming thoroughly and drinking some of Thomas's pine needle tea. His face had regained feeling, his hands were functional, and his mind was racing with implications. He'd seen something that shouldn't exist, comfortable warmth in the middle of record-breaking cold, achieved with minimal resources by a 15-year-old orphan using techniques white society had dismissed as primitive. Word spread through Browning within 2 days. Reese told the story at the general store, at the town meeting called to coordinate cold relief efforts, at the ranch where he worked. The reaction was predictable: disbelief, skepticism, accusations that Reese was lying or exaggerating, or had been fooled by a boy with a death wish. But Clayton Hutchins listened differently. He'd spent 4 days burning through his winter wood supply, spent money he didn't have, buying more wood at inflated crisis prices, watched his wife sicken and his son injured, and felt the complete failure of the building methods everyone assumed were the only methods that worked. If there was even a chance that a different approach existed, an approach that didn't require cords of wood and constant labor, he needed to see it. On February 3rd, with the temperature at 12 below and the county still in crisis, Hutchins rode up to the granite shelf. This time, he didn't announce his coming. He just arrived mid-morning, dismounted, and called out, "Thomas, it's Hutchins. Reese said I should come see what you've built." Thomas emerged from the tunnel, dressed in a cotton shirt and canvas pants, no coat. Hutchins stared. The boy should have been bundled in layers, shivering, showing signs of cold stress. Instead, he looked comfortable. "Come inside," Thomas said. Hutchins followed him down the tunnel, felt the temperature change at the bend, emerged into the main chamber, and stopped. The warmth was immediate and undeniable. He stood for a moment, letting his cold, tightened muscles relax, feeling sensation return to his cheeks and nose. "What are you burning?" he asked. "Small fire twice a day," Thomas said. He showed Hutchins the firebox, the heated stones, explained the system. Then he gestured to the walls. "Put your hand on the stone." Hutchins did. The interior wall was warm, not hot, but genuinely warm, like stone in afternoon sun. "How?" Thermal mass, Thomas said. He pulled Agnes's journal from a shelf and opened to a page where he'd made calculations. Stone holds heat, 8 times more heat per pound than wood. These walls are filled with earth between inner and outer stone layers. Earth insulates and adds more thermal mass. The tunnel blocks wind and cold air. The pyramid shape sheds weather. The orientation catches winter sun. Everything works together. Hutchins looked at the numbers. Heat capacity calculations, temperature records, wood consumption logs. Thomas had documented everything. "What's the temperature now?" 63, Thomas said, pointing to the thermometer. "Outside is 12 below, Hutchins said. That's a 75-degree difference." "Yes." Hutchins sat heavily on the stone floor. His pride wanted to reject what he was seeing, wanted to find flaws, wanted to maintain that the methods he'd used all his life were the correct methods. But his body was warming in a space that should have been deadly cold, warmed by a system that used less wood in a week than he burned in a day, built by a boy he'd called crazy. "Will you teach this?" Hutchins asked finally. "People died, Thomas. More will die if we get another cold spell like that. Most folks burn through their wood supplies. They can't afford to buy more. If there's another way, a way that uses less fuel, they need to learn it." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Agnes taught me freely. I'll teach others the same way." Over the next 3 weeks, 47 people came to see the pyramid: ranchers, townspeople, Blackfeet families from the reservation. Thomas showed each one the design principles, explained the thermal mass concept, demonstrated the firebox system. He gave tours of the interior, let people touch the warm walls, see the temperature difference with their own eyes. Some understood immediately. Others struggled to accept that stone could hold heat better than burning wood in iron stoves. But the proof was undeniable. A 15-year-old boy had survived the worst cold in memory, survived comfortably, using techniques that everyone had dismissed. By spring, 19 people had begun constructing their own versions. Most didn't build pyramids. The shape was strange, hard to explain to neighbors, but they incorporated the core principles: earth-bermed walls, south-facing entrances, thermal mass, tunnel entries, fireboxes instead of iron stoves. Structures built into hillsides rather than on top of the land. The University of Montana sent an engineering professor in March who spent 3 days taking measurements, making calculations, and finally admitting that Thomas's design was sound. "It's essentially a passive solar thermal battery," the professor wrote in his report. "The structure collects, stores, and releases heat with remarkable efficiency. The principles are scientifically valid and should be more widely implemented." By the time Thomas registered his 6-month residence in April, his name was known throughout Glacier County. Not famous, he'd given no speeches, sought no publicity, but known among those who paid attention to how people survived in the harsh places. Thomas lived in the pyramid for 43 years. He married a Blackfeet woman named Sarah in 1939, and they raised 4 children in an expanded version of the original structure, with additional chambers added to the south side using the same principles. He worked as a hunting guide, trapped furs, and taught cold weather survival techniques to anyone who asked. He never charged for the teaching. Knowledge, Agnes had said, was meant to be shared. Over those decades, Thomas built 17 more structures using the pyramid design: shelters for families displaced by economic hardship, for elderly people whose timber cabins had become unmanageable, for young couples just starting out who couldn't afford conventional construction. Each structure was custom designed for its specific site, oriented to capture maximum solar gain, built with available materials, engineered for passive thermal efficiency. He never wrote a book, never patented the design, never sought recognition beyond the quiet respect of his community. He simply lived, built, and taught. By the time he died in 1977, at age 58, lung cancer, likely from a lifetime of campfire smoke, the techniques he'd pioneered had influenced cold weather construction throughout the northern Rockies. Not universally, not dramatically, but significantly. Some of the Blackfeet tribal housing incorporated earth berming and thermal mass. Some ranchers had rebuilt using passive solar principles. The county hospital built a storage facility partially underground with thick walls and minimal heating requirements. The original pyramid shelter still stands. It's been modernized, a small wood stove added in the 1950s, electric lights installed in the 1960s, insulation upgraded in the 1990s, but the core structure remains unchanged. The stones Thomas fitted by hand at age 15 still form walls that hold heat with remarkable efficiency. On cold January nights, the interior stays at 55 degrees with no active heating, simply from stored thermal mass and earth insulation. Thomas's funeral was attended by 143 people. His eldest son gave the eulogy, speaking about a man who'd been called crazy at 15, who'd proved the doubters wrong, not with words, but with thermometers and survival, who'd lived according to principles taught by a grandmother, who'd learned them from people who had survived without metal stoves or manufactured insulation for thousands of years. "My father never claimed to invent anything," the son said. "He always said he'd just listened to what Grandmother Agnes taught him, and she'd learned from her grandmother, and back and back. The wisdom wasn't his, but the courage to apply it, to trust it when everyone said it would fail, that was his." The funeral ended with a traditional Blackfeet blessing, and they buried Thomas beside the pyramid, with Agnes's grave 20 yards away. A stone marker was placed between them, with words Thomas had requested in his will. They taught that earth keeps you warmer than fighting ever could. The pyramid is now maintained by Thomas's great-granddaughter, who gives occasional tours to architecture students and cold climate construction researchers. She's added markers for Thomas, for Agnes, and for Sarah, who died in 1989. Each marker includes brief epitaphs. Agnes Whitehorse. She taught the old wisdom, and it saved more than she knew. Thomas Whitehorse. He built what they said couldn't work and proved warm is a measurement, not an argument. Sarah Whitehorse. She believed in both her husband and the earth, and raised 4 children in the shelter they built together. The cold spell of January 1935 tested an assumption that had gone unchallenged, that the way white settlers had always built in Montana, timber boxes with iron stoves and massive wood consumption, was the way building should be done. Thomas proved that wrong, not with theory, but with thermometers, and with the simple fact of his survival. The principles he used were ancient, developed by indigenous peoples across the Arctic and subarctic regions over thousands of years. The Inuit built underground winter homes with long tunnel entrances and stone-lined interiors that stayed at 40 degrees when outside temperatures reached 60 below. The Norse built turf houses in Iceland and Greenland with earth-covered roofs and thick sod walls. The Blackfeet and other plains tribes used semi-subterranean winter lodges with earth insulation when timber wasn't available. Traditional Korean homes used ondol systems, heated stone floors that radiated warmth from a single fire for hours. Modern science has confirmed what Agnes knew intuitively. Thermal mass works because specific heat capacity varies by material. Stone and earth can absorb and store far more heat energy per unit of mass than air or wood. Passive solar design works because the sun delivers consistent energy that can be captured through proper orientation and thermal mass. Earth insulation works because soil has remarkably low thermal conductivity. Heat moves through it slowly, creating a stable temperature buffer. Thomas succeeded because he was willing to question the assumption that modernity had all the answers. He had nothing, no money, no tools, no family, no support. But he had observation, patience, willingness to learn from dismissed traditions, and courage to build what others called impossible. What the lumber companies and stove manufacturers built quickly and profitably became obsolete within decades as heating costs made them unsustainable. What a 15-year-old orphan built slowly and carefully still stands, still works, still demonstrates that sometimes the primitive solution is more sophisticated than the advanced one. There's a deeper lesson about knowledge, how easily we dismiss entire bodies of wisdom because they come from people or cultures we've decided are less advanced than ourselves. Agnes's grandmother knew how to survive Montana winters. She knew it not from books, but from lived experience, from generations of refinement, from necessity. That knowledge was treated as quaint folklore until a boy used it to survive conditions that killed 16 people using modern methods. Thomas never became famous, never wrote books, never sought patents or profit. He simply lived, built, and taught when asked. The 19 structures he personally constructed sheltered perhaps 120 people over the years, providing warmth and safety when conventional systems failed. The techniques he demonstrated influenced hundreds more structures across the northern Rockies, saving countless cords of wood, countless dollars, and quite possibly saving lives during subsequent cold spells. Most of those structures are gone now, replaced by modern insulated construction as economic conditions changed. But the knowledge survives. Architecture students still visit the pyramid. Cold climate researchers still take measurements. Indigenous knowledge advocates still point to Thomas's story as proof that traditional wisdom deserves respect and serious study. So, here's the question for you. What dismissed knowledge exists in your community, your culture, your family history? What wisdom have you written off as outdated or primitive without actually testing whether it works? What might happen if you looked at it the way Thomas looked at his grandmother's teachings, not as folklore, but as functional information developed through centuries of trial and refinement? If this story resonated, if it made you think differently about how we decide whose knowledge matters, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, leave a comment about what spoke to you, and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things through patience, observation, and courage to question the dominant narrative. Because sometimes the best shelter isn't the one everyone agrees is correct. Sometimes it's the one you build with your own two hands. The wisdom of those who came before, and the courage to prove that survival is measured in degrees, not in arguments.